So I'm just going to skip through that actually. So I'd like to turn to talk about juveniles in detention in Australia. And many of you will have at some stage seen our publication on juveniles in detention in Australia. We put it out every year, and we have data that go back to 1981. So we've got almost 3 decades of data on juveniles in detention in Australia. The project initially, it was a recommendation actually of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody. So essentially it was deemed really important that we start to monitor Indigenous juveniles in detention, and of course we also therefore need to monitor non-Indigenous juveniles in detention so we can make comparisons. So the data set is actually quite basic. We essentially, at midnight at the end of every quarter, so on the last day of March, June, September and December, somebody in every juvenile justice detention centre in Australia counts how many young people are in there, and they break it down by Indigenous status, age, sex, jurisdiction of course, and legal status. So whether the young person is sentenced or on remand. And that's a really important issue which I'll come back to. So I just wanted to give you a few of the key trends, I guess, over that time. This just shows the rate per 100,000 juveniles in detention from 1981 to our most recent collection period, which was 2008. So you can see that there's actually been a pretty substantial decline in rates of juveniles in detention over that time. That was most dramatic probably until about 2002. In the last few years you can see there's been a slight but a steady increase in that rate of juveniles in detention. So there are a couple of really key issues that emerge when we look at this data set. One of those is Indigenous overrepresentation. So Indigenous juveniles have been substantially overrepresented in detention in Australia since 1994, which is just when we started measuring this. So you can see here that overrepresentation has increased from 17 times to 24 times. Now all that means is in 1994, Indigenous juveniles were 17 times as likely to be detained as non-Indigenous juveniles. They're now 24 times as likely to be detained as non-Indigenous juveniles. A really important issue to understand there though is that when we look at just the rates of Indigenous and non-Indigenous juveniles in detention, I mean there are 2 really important things. First of all, you can see there that the overrepresentation of Indigenous juveniles is very dramatic, but what you can also see is that it hasn't actually really changed. It's fluctuated over that time, but the end result hasn't really changed very much at all. For non-Indigenous juveniles, now I know that doesn't look like a very dramatic sort of decrease, but that's because the rate has been very low the whole time. That's actually a decrease of almost 1/3. So a really important thing that we need to focus on in the future is how are we being successful in keeping non-Indigenous juveniles out of detention, which we're clearly doing, and why haven't we been successful in keeping Indigenous juveniles out of detention, and what can we do about it? The other really key issue at the moment is remand. So if anyone's involved in juvenile justice, I go to lots of sort of juvenile justice forums and conferences, and remand is just, the key issue of the moment. So you can see here that the proportion of juveniles on remand in detention has increased pretty dramatically since 1981. It's in fact tripled. So just to backtrack a little bit, juveniles who are in detention are either sentenced, so they've been found guilty by a court and been given a sentence of detention, or they're on remand, which just means they're waiting for a court, either a trial or an outcome or a sentence. So that's gone up really dramatically over that time. And that's problematic. It's problematic for a number of reasons. I'll give you a couple. The first is that, if you remember at the beginning, juvenile justice legislation in Australia is based on the idea of detention as a last resort. And having 2/3 of our juvenile detention population unsentenced is clearly inconsistent with that principle. Secondly, and I think this is incredibly interesting and incredibly disturbing, only a very small proportion of juveniles on remand actually go on to be sentenced to detention. So the latest figures we have from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare show that it was less than 7% of kids on remand were actually then sentenced to detention. So this is a key issue for future consideration. I just wanted to talk about another ad hoc project that I've recently completed here at AIC. So this is a completely different sort of project from that. And the project looked at measuring juvenile recidivism. So it was funded by a body called the Australasian Juvenile Justice Administrators, who are essentially just the CEO of each statutory juvenile justice authority in Australia. And it grew out of their perceived need to accurately measure juvenile recidivism in Australia. So they wanted to be able to measure juvenile recidivism in a way that makes sense, firstly, because believe me, what most jurisdictions are currently doing simply does not make sense. And they want to be able to measure juvenile recidivism in a way that's comparable with the other jurisdictions. So one of the key challenges that we face as staff here at AIC is that as a national body, we're essentially working with 8 jurisdictions who invariably do things in different ways. And so until now, it's been really easy for the jurisdictions to say things like, oh, well, of course, juvenile recidivism is much higher in Western Australia than it is in Tasmania because we count it differently. And so there's this idea that everything comes back to some type of methodological artefact. And so the push to develop these national counting measures is going to overcome those limitations, hopefully. So my role in this project was firstly to document what each jurisdiction was doing in terms of measuring juvenile recidivism. So I interviewed the appropriate people in each jurisdiction. And then my role was to design some counting rules that the jurisdictions would all agree to use. The project was really technical in nature. It's essentially the provision of technical advice to an external stakeholder. And this is the sort of research that we're doing more and more of at AIC. For example, a project that I'm currently working on is quite similar in nature, and it involves providing advice to the Commonwealth Attorney General's Department about data collection on Aboriginal night patrols in the Northern Territory. So the question again is a quite technical one. It's what data should we be collecting and what should we actually be doing with it? That's often not something that people on the ground think about when they set up these types of projects. So my task on the Juvenile Recidivism project was at times incredibly challenging for a number of reasons. Firstly, while the jurisdictions are aware of the importance of measuring juvenile recidivism, they're also aware that juvenile recidivism is a really politically sensitive issue. While the representatives of each jurisdiction genuinely want to have better ways of calculating juvenile recidivism, they were also keenly aware that particular methods of measuring recidivism can have substantial impacts on the amount of recidivism that they have to report on. So this has real implications for juvenile justice departments and the policies and, of course, the budgets that they have to administer. So just to give you an example of one of those issues, one of the key things that we had to work out sounds simple. It was simply, over what period are we going to measure juvenile recidivism? And this, of course, the longer you track people in terms of measuring their recidivism, the more likely you are to find an enormous amount of recidivism. I mean, if we only track people once they come out of detention for a week, well, most of them probably won't have had time to reoffend. If we track them for 10 years, they probably will all have reoffended. So choosing this period of time over which we can all agree to measure recidivism was one of the really controversial issues in this project. There's no right or wrong answer. It was simply a matter of finding something that everyone could live with. So after ongoing debate and discussion and consultation with all the jurisdictions, they ultimately decided that 1 year would be the preferred length of time over which to measure juvenile recidivism. So those counting rules will now go out to the jurisdictions and they'll be tested, and over coming years they will hopefully result in some national comparable measures of juvenile recidivism. So just to conclude, the AIC has a very long history monitoring juveniles in detention in Australia, but our work on other aspects of juvenile crime and justice is only sort of recently coming into fruition. We recognise that this is a key area within criminology in Australia, and it's certainly one that we aim to contribute towards in coming years.